Hi, this is Brad, and welcome to the Analog Universe, Episode 3, The Analog Universe. Today we're going to talk about how I got that name, the Analog Universe. So, people my age will remember back in the day, we kind of lived in an analog universe. Our phones were analog. We spoke into the phone, and when we spoke, the sound from our voice traveled in sound waves to the receiver in the phone, which translated those sound waves to electromagnetic waves that then were transmitted over the wires in electromagnetic waves. And so the entire conversation on that phone was transmitted through analog means. It was all through the use of waves. Our music was like that. Everything was transmitted via waves. Our whole world was analog until we got to the late 80s, and then big time in the 90s, we saw the world kind of change into a digital world where we started talking on digital phones. We started listening to CDs, and our music came to us digitally. And the personal computers that we started using in the 80s and big time into the 90s, of course, were all digital. Everything was translated into a series of ones and zeros, and that's how information was transferred from then on. And now we live in this kind of a digital world. Okay, well, that's fairly well known, but what does that have to do with our universe? So let's go back to 1897. In 1897, they discovered the electron. And soon after the discovery of the electron, they discovered the photoelectric effect. The photoelectric effect works like this. You shine light onto a particular kind of metal, and the energy from the light beam will eject electrons from the surface of that metal. But it's very specific. If you shine red light onto the metal, it doesn't matter how bright that red light is, you're not going to kick off any electrons from that metal. It just doesn't work. You start changing the color of that light through the spectrum until you get to the blue end of the spectrum, and you'll start finally knocking free some electrons once you get to blue light. Keep turning the color of the light past the visual spectrum into the ultraviolet range, and now you're going to get lots of electrons knocked off that plate. So that started physicists thinking, we can shine a very bright red light onto the metal and nothing happens. We can shine a much weaker ultraviolet light and you get plenty of electrons from the metal. We always thought, and this had been for a couple hundred years, people had thought that light traveled in waves through some kind of cosmic medium. They called it the ether back then. And that's how they thought light traveled. But then they said, hey, this photoelectric effect doesn't seem to work like that. Light must travel in packets of energy, and these packets of energy must knock these electrons off. So therefore, light must be particles. But that had problems because sometimes light acted like waves, as we'll get into in a moment. So everyone was kind of scratching their head at that point. Enter Albert Einstein in 1905, and he came up with his theory of light quanta. So according to Einstein's paper that he wrote in 1905, Light travels in quantum packets of energy. And these packets are individual packets, but they also have wave-like aspects to them. Okay, so what does that mean? They're kind of particles, but they're kind of waves. If you're confused, you're in good company. Einstein himself, remember, he came out with this theory in 1905. And in a letter to a friend in 1951, he said, "All these 50 years of pondering have not brought me any closer to the question, what are light quanta?" Okay, so even Einstein was confused about what exactly this was. But remember, Einstein and the physicists were all operating mathematically. And the math worked. So again, how can you question it if the math is right? But still, there were times when light completely acted as a wave. So when does light travel as a wave and when does it travel as a particle? That gets to the question of collapse into a wave function. So light's traveling as a particle, and then at some point it collapses into a wave. When does that happen? Why does that happen? Literally, there have been volumes written on this issue. And as Einstein said, after all these years of pondering, we're no closer to an answer than we were in the beginning. We just don't know. That's one of those things that I'm saying we've looked for these answers for over 100 years and we're still not finding them. Not only are we not finding them, we're not getting any closer to an answer. Okay, so that gets us to one of the most famous experiments in physics, the double slit experiment. The double slit experiment works like this. You have a piece of cardboard and you have a slit in the cardboard. And on the far side is a black wall. And you shine a light through that slit in the cardboard and you get a line of light on the black wall just exactly as you would have expected. Okay, now you cut a second slit in the cardboard and then you shine a light through those two slits. You don't get two lines of light on the wall, which is what you would expect, but what you get is a series of lines. So what's happening here? Think of it as you've got two boats traveling next to each other on a calm lake, and they're both leaving a wake behind them. And as the wake spreads out, the waves from each wake cross each other in a pattern kind of like this. And what's happening is that at some point, those waves are going on top of the other waves and they're making larger waves. And at some point, those waves are canceling each other out and they're not making any waves. And you get a pattern that's known as an interference pattern. And that happens with waves. And what's happening with this double slit experiment is these lines that you're seeing on the wall reflect the interference pattern that's happening between these two waves. Okay, that's standard physics stuff, but it means the light is passing through those two slits as a wave. Could somehow this be happening with photons? But what you hear when you hear anybody talk about the double slit experiment is that physicists have been able to turn down the amplitude of the light such that only one quantum unit of light will pass through those slits at a time, what we now call photons. Only one photon will pass through those slits at a time. So you turn on this light very low and a photon passes through one of the slits and You've got photographic paper on the other side, and you see a dot where the photon landed. Okay, you keep the light on, and another photon passes through the slit, and you see another dot where the photon landed on the photographic paper. And you keep it on for a long time, and what you see is this pattern of dots on the paper where the photons have landed. They're still creating these lines on the paper that show that there's an interference pattern. The individual photons are going through the paper one at a time, yet you still get an interference pattern. If you have a photon, a particle of light going through a slit one at a time, it can't be interfering with anything else, yet the pattern shows that it is. So this has caused a great amount of consternation, and again, volumes have been written about this over the years, but we're still no closer to an answer. So let me throw out this analogy. Let's say that we lived in a time before we knew that sound traveled in waves, and we were wondering, how does sound travel? And let's say there was a malignant alien, and this alien just liked to trick us. So he created this experiment, and what it was is he had a very, 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 very thin film on his wall. And on the other side of that film were tiny balloons. The slightest touch of the balloon would cause it to pop. The balloons were filled with black dye, and you would see a black dot on this film. But we don't know anything about the balloons. We're just looking at this blank wall, and that's all we see is the blank wall. We don't know what's on the other side of it. And so our alien turns on a sound source next to us. We're sitting here looking at the wall. And it's a very low tone. Ba. And as the tone's sounding, he turns it up louder and louder and louder, and nothing happens. Okay. So then he turns down the volume, and he turns up the tone until it makes a very high-pitched tone. Ah. Okay, and now with the volume even lower, we're starting to see black dots on the wall. And here's what's happening. When the alien played the low tone, the sound was traveling out in waves, but the distance between each successive wave was far enough that a wave would hit the wall, this gossamer thin film, and push against the balloons ever so slightly, but not quite enough to pop a balloon. Then before the next wave got to the wall, the film would rebound enough so that it was in its normal position. When the next wave hit the wall, it would push it in a little bit, but not enough to pop the balloon. You turn the tone up to where you have a very high-pitched tone. Now you've got very small wavelengths. The distance between each successive wave is very short. So what's happening is, instead of those waves hitting the wall, in relatively slow intervals, those waves that are so close together are hitting the wall very quickly, and the wall's not having enough time to rebound back to its initial position before the next wave hits it. And they keep hitting it until they finally push it far enough into a balloon that a balloon pops. That, of course, relieves some of the pressure, allowing the wall to rebound somewhat. But the waves keep coming, and sooner or later another balloon pops, and then another balloon. And if you turn up the volume on that high sound, then you're going to see lots of waves popping. And we're watching this and we're saying, oh, look at that. Because all we can see is just these black dots on the wall. And we say, oh, sound obviously travels in particles. Well, obviously it doesn't. It travels in waves, but what we're seeing makes it appear to us as though it's traveling in particles. And then the alien does this double slit experiment. And he turns down the volume, and this high-pitched sound goes through the slits, and you see a dot on the wall on the other side of the slits. And it does this so that the dots slowly appear one by one, and eventually you get the interference pattern. And again, you're sitting here and you and I are scratching our heads and saying, sounds obviously traveling in particles, but it also has a wave-like function to it too, because you can see that there's an interference pattern there. Well, what's really happening, of course, is sound's just traveling in waves. The appearance of spots on the wall have to do with the interaction of the sound waves and the wall. Okay, so that's my analogy, and you get where I'm going with this. How do we know that's not happening with the double slit experiment? You have the double slits, you've got the photographic paper on the other side of it, you've got the light moving through the slits. What's to say that it's not moving in waves, and the dots we're seeing on the photographic paper have everything to do with the interaction between the light waves and the photographic paper. And there's no light particles involved whatsoever. If we can explain this phenomenon with sound without requiring particles, why couldn't this be an explanation for the light double slit experiment? I'm just asking the question. So that's one answer to what's happening to this 100-year-old question about what's happening in this double slit experiment. That there are no light quanta. Light never travels in photons. It never travels in particles. It always travels in waves. But what we observe when light interacts with atoms on a wall or on a piece of paper or whatever, make it appear to us that it has been traveling as particles. Okay, so there's one answer. That's my answer. Am I right? I don't know. I'm just asking the questions. All I'm saying here in this series is we've been looking in the same direction for 100 years and we don't see any answers. Let's try some of these new directions. Could they show us some answers? We'll never know if we don't look. And so that's why I'm calling this the analog universe. That light doesn't travel in photons, little individual packets of energy. It travels in waves, and it always has. So that puts us back in an analog universe where information travels in waves and no longer in what might be called a digital universe of light traveling in individual packets of information like the ones and zeros our computers use. So write a response. I'd love to hear what people have to say about this. But of course, I'll never hear what people have to say about this if people don't see my channel. If you don't like each of these episodes, if you don't subscribe to it, YouTube's not going to give priority to it, and nobody will end up seeing these channels. So like and subscribe. I'm not going to keep saying this every time, like every channel you see, but this is my one pitch. Like, subscribe, so other people can see this and we can start the conversation I think we should start having. So join me next time when we talk about the world's most famous equation. See you then.